Dr. Amara Stevens adjusted her tailored blazer as she stepped out of the black sedan onto the marble steps of the prestigious Whitmore Club. At 35, she had built Technova Solutions from a startup in her garage into a billion-dollar enterprise, revolutionizing artificial intelligence applications across healthcare, finance, and education. Her company's innovations had saved countless lives and generated unprecedented efficiency gains across multiple industries. Yet as she approached the ornate doors of the exclusive business club, she felt the familiar weight of being the only Black woman in spaces where power brokers gathered. The invitation had arrived 3 weeks ago, embossed with gold lettering and bearing the seal of the International Business Consortium. Annual Strategic Summit, Shaping Tomorrow's Markets, read the headline, with her name printed beneath a list of the world's most influential CEOs. She had earned her place at this table through years of relentless innovation, strategic acquisitions, and market dominance. Her AI platform had disrupted traditional business models, forcing established corporations to adapt or become obsolete. Inside the opulent venue, crystal chandeliers cast warm light over mahogany panels and leather-bound volumes. The air hummed with conversations about market trends, regulatory changes, and billion-dollar deals. Amara recognized faces from Forbes covers and CNBC interviews, titans of industry who commanded respect and wielded influence across global markets. She had studied their strategies, learned from their successes, and in many cases, outmaneuvered them in competitive bidding for lucrative contracts. As she approached the registration table, the elderly white clerk looked up with a practiced smile that faltered slightly upon seeing her. "Good evening. I'm here for the Consortium Summit," Amara said, extending her platinum invitation. The clerk's eyes narrowed as he scrutinized the document, comparing her face to his guest list with unnecessary thoroughness. Behind her, other executives were waved through without question, their credentials accepted with deferential nods and warm greetings. The networking reception was already in full swing when she entered the main hall. Groups of men in expensive suits clustered around high-top tables, their conversations punctuated by hearty laughter and confident handshakes. She moved through the crowd with purpose, introducing herself to potential partners and competitors alike. Some recognized her immediately, their expressions shifting from surprise to calculated respect as they processed her identity. Others required gentle reminders of her company's recent acquisition of their former business partners or the patents that had rendered their products obsolete. By the evening's end, Amara had secured preliminary discussions for 3 major joint ventures and identified several acquisition targets. She had proven once again that her presence in these elite circles was not just warranted but essential. Tomorrow's formal sessions would determine the direction of global markets for years to come, and she intended to be at the center of those decisions. Little did she know that the real test of her resilience and strategic brilliance would come not from boardroom negotiations, but from a moment of casual cruelty that would unleash her most devastating business maneuver yet. The second day of the Consortium Summit began with continental breakfast served in the club's Heritage Room, where portraits of founding members gazed down from oil-painted frames. Amara arrived early, armed with market research and prepared to discuss the 3 partnership proposals that had emerged from the previous evening's networking. She had spent the night reviewing financial statements, analyzing competitive landscapes, and crafting strategic frameworks that would benefit all parties while maintaining her company's market position. At precisely 8 o'clock, she approached the reserved table where Harrison Blackwell, CEO of Meridian Financial, sat with 3 other executives. Blackwell had built his empire through aggressive lending practices and strategic acquisitions, commanding assets worth over $50 billion. His company had dominated commercial finance for 2 decades, but recent regulatory changes and fintech disruptions had threatened their traditional revenue streams. The partnership Amara proposed could revitalize their digital offerings while providing Technova with access to established client networks. "Mr. Blackwell, I believe we have much to discuss regarding the blockchain integration proposal," she began, placing her portfolio on the polished table. The conversation around the table ceased abruptly as 4 sets of eyes turned toward her. Blackwell's companions, CEOs of major manufacturing and pharmaceutical companies, exchanged glances that spoke volumes about their surprise at her presence. I'm sorry, Blackwell said slowly, his voice carrying the entitled drawl of old money and older prejudices. But who invited her to this table? His tone was not merely questioning but dismissive, as though her very presence was an administrative error that needed correction. The phrase hung in the air like a toxic cloud, its implications reverberating through the sudden silence that had fallen over nearby tables. Amara felt the familiar heat of humiliation rise in her chest, but her expression remained perfectly composed. She had faced such moments throughout her career, in venture capital meetings where investors questioned her technical expertise, in boardrooms where her ideas were initially dismissed then later attributed to male colleagues, in industry conferences where she was mistaken for support staff despite being the keynote speaker. Each experience had taught her valuable lessons about resilience, strategic patience, and the power of turning discrimination into competitive advantage. I invited myself, Mr. Blackwell, she replied with crystalline clarity, her voice carrying enough authority to command attention from tables throughout the room. Just as I invited myself into markets you thought were impenetrable, partnerships you assumed were exclusive, and profit margins you believed were yours by right. Her words were measured and precise, each syllable calculated for maximum impact. The other executives shifted uncomfortably as the weight of recognition settled over them. They had underestimated her before, dismissed her innovations as trendy rather than transformational, overlooked her strategic moves as lucky rather than calculated. Now they were beginning to understand that their casual bigotry had awakened something far more dangerous than their comfortable prejudices could contain. Amara smiled with the confidence of someone who had just been handed an unexpected gift. Blackwell's question had revealed more than his character. It had exposed the fundamental weakness in their entire power structure. They still operated under the assumption that success belonged to people who looked like them, talked like them, and shared their narrow worldview. That assumption would become the foundation of their downfall. Within hours of Blackwell's insulting question, Amara had transformed her hotel suite into a war room. Her laptop screens displayed real-time market data, competitor analysis, and regulatory filings that painted a comprehensive picture of her adversaries' vulnerabilities. She had built Teknova specifically to disrupt established power structures, but now she would deploy her resources with surgical precision against those who believed their prejudices made them invulnerable. Her first call was to Marcus Chun, her chief technology officer and closest confidant since their graduate school days at Stanford. "Marcus, I need you to accelerate Project Prometheus," she said, referencing their most ambitious artificial intelligence initiative. The project had been in development for 18 months, designed to revolutionize financial services through predictive analytics and automated decision-making. Originally scheduled for beta testing in 6 months, she now needed it operational within 30 days. The second call went to Sarah Williams, Teknova's head of strategic partnerships and former Goldman Sachs managing director. "Sarah, remember those regulatory contacts you mentioned? The ones investigating predatory lending practices in commercial finance? I think it's time we had those conversations." Sarah's background in investment banking had provided invaluable insights into the complex web of relationships that governed major financial institutions, including the questionable practices that kept them profitable. By evening, Amara had assembled her core leadership team via encrypted video conference. 8 brilliant minds appeared on her screen: engineers, lawyers, economists, and strategists who had helped build Teknova into an industry juggernaut. They represented diverse backgrounds and experiences, united by their commitment to innovation and their loyalty to Amara's vision of technology as a force for positive disruption. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice carrying the quiet intensity that her team had learned to recognize as a prelude to their most ambitious campaigns, "we're about to demonstrate why underestimating us is the most expensive mistake our competitors can make." She outlined her strategy with characteristic precision, a multi-phase assault that would target her adversaries' core business models while positioning Teknova as the inevitable alternative. Phase 1 would involve releasing Project Prometheus ahead of schedule, directly competing with Meridian Financial's traditional lending algorithms. Their AI could process loan applications in minutes rather than days, assess risk with unprecedented accuracy, and offer competitive rates that would attract Meridian's most profitable clients. The technology wasn't just better, it was revolutionary, representing the future of financial services. Phase 2 targeted the pharmaceutical and manufacturing companies whose CEOs had witnessed Blackwell's insult without objection. Technova supply chain optimization software could reduce their operational costs by 15% while improving delivery times and quality control. She would offer these solutions to their competitors at below market rates, creating pricing pressure that would force difficult strategic decisions. The third phase was perhaps most elegant in its simplicity. She would acquire their suppliers, partners, and key personnel through a combination of competitive offers and strategic investments. Her war chest included $3 billion in readily available capital plus access to additional funding through venture partnerships and strategic alliances. Remember, she concluded, this isn't about revenge. It's about demonstrating the inevitable consequences of clinging to outdated assumptions about who deserves to succeed in modern markets. They asked who invited me. I'm going to show them that I don't need their invitations to reshape their entire industry. Her team responded with enthusiasm that bordered on excitement. They had witnessed similar campaigns before, calculated demolitions of competitors who had underestimated Technova's capabilities, but never with such personal stakes and strategic clarity. The announcement came at 6 a.m. Eastern, timed perfectly to catch financial markets during their most volatile opening hours. Technova's press release was a masterpiece of corporate communication. Revolutionary AI platform transforms commercial lending industry. The accompanying demonstration showed Project Prometheus processing complex loan applications in real time, making approval decisions based on thousands of data points that traditional banks couldn't access or analyze effectively. Financial journalists immediately recognized the implications. Technova wasn't just entering the commercial lending market, they were redefining it entirely. Their AI platform could evaluate creditworthiness using non-traditional metrics, social media engagement patterns, supply chain relationships, employee satisfaction scores, and environmental impact assessments. The result was a more accurate risk profile than conventional credit scoring could provide, enabling better rates for qualified borrowers and more profitable outcomes for lenders. Within 2 hours, Meridian Financial's stock price had dropped 12%. Institutional investors understood that Technova's technology represented an existential threat to traditional banking models. Phone calls flooded into Meridian's corporate headquarters as major clients inquired about competitive alternatives and shareholders demanded explanations for the company's outdated technology infrastructure. Harrison Blackwell convened an emergency board meeting at 10 a.m., his usual composure cracked by the speed and precision of Amara's attack. This is temporary market volatility, he assured his directors, though his voice lacked its customary confidence. We have established relationships that technology cannot replicate. Our clients value personal service and proven expertise over flashy algorithms. His head of technology, however, painted a more sobering picture. Sir, their platform is genuinely revolutionary. They're processing loan applications that would take us weeks to evaluate, and their default prediction accuracy is higher than anything we've achieved. Several of our largest clients have already requested meetings to discuss switching to their services. Meanwhile, Amara is personally calling Meridian's most valuable clients, offering competitive rates and superior service through her new platform. Her conversations were brief and professional, focusing on concrete benefits rather than emotional appeals. She knew that business relationships, regardless of their personal foundations, ultimately depended on performance and value creation. Mr. Davidson, she said during a call with Meridian's largest commercial client, I understand you've been seeking more favorable terms for your expansion financing. Our AI platform can offer you rates that are 2 points below your current arrangement, with approval times measured in hours rather than weeks. The conversation lasted 15 minutes, ending with Davidson's agreement to submit a test application through Technova's system. By market close, 3 of Meridian's top 10 clients had initiated the process of transferring their accounts to Technova's platform. The financial media coverage was uniformly positive, portraying Amara as a visionary entrepreneur whose technological innovations were democratizing access to capital while improving efficiency across the entire lending industry. That evening, she received a terse voicemail from Harrison Blackwell. Miss Stevens, I believe we may have gotten off on the wrong foot. Perhaps we could discuss a mutually beneficial partnership. His tone was carefully neutral, but Amara detected the underlying desperation of a man watching his empire crumble in real time. She didn't return his call. The first strike had been devastatingly effective, but it was merely the opening movement of a larger symphony of destruction. Tomorrow would bring phase 2 of her campaign, targeting the pharmaceutical and manufacturing executives who had witnessed her humiliation without intervening. They would learn that silence in the face of discrimination carried its own price in modern markets. While Meridian Financial reeled from the initial assault, Amara shifted her attention to the pharmaceutical giant Apex Therapeutics, whose CEO Richard Steinberg had sat silently as Blackwell delivered his insulting question. Steinberg's company dominated the market for specialized medical devices, but their supply chain was notoriously inefficient, plagued by delays and quality control issues that inflated costs and frustrated healthcare providers. Technova's supply chain optimization software represented a quantum leap beyond traditional logistics management. Using machine learning algorithms and predictive analytics, the platform could anticipate bottlenecks, optimize routing, reduce waste, and ensure quality compliance across complex manufacturing networks. Beta testing with smaller companies had demonstrated cost reductions of up to 20% while improving delivery reliability and product quality. Rather than offering this technology to Apex directly, Amara implemented a more devastating strategy. She approached Steinberg's 3 largest competitors with an irresistible proposition: exclusive access to Technova's supply chain optimization platform at 50% below market rates for the first 2 years. The only condition was that they agree to exclusivity within the medical device sector, preventing Apex from accessing the technology until their competitive position had been irreversibly damaged. Dr. Morrison, she said during a video call with the CEO of MedTech Solutions, Apex's primary rival, I'm offering you the opportunity to leapfrog your competition using technology that they cannot access. Your operational efficiency will improve dramatically while their costs continue to escalate. The market share implications should be significant. Dr. Morrison was intrigued but cautious. This seems almost too good to be true, Ms. Stevens. Why such favorable terms for us specifically? His question was reasonable. Successful business leaders always questioned unexpected generosity from competitors. Because I believe in partnering with companies that share my vision of innovation and inclusion, Amara replied smoothly. Your company has consistently demonstrated commitment to diversity and technological advancement. I prefer working with organizations whose values align with mine. The subtext was clear. Apex had failed both tests through their CEO's complicit silence. Within 48 hours, all 3 competitors had signed preliminary agreements. The news broke simultaneously across industry trade publications. Technova partners with leading medical device manufacturers to revolutionize supply chain management. The articles highlighted projected cost savings, efficiency improvements, and competitive advantages that would reshape the entire sector. Steinberg's reaction was swift and predictable. His assistant called Technova's offices repeatedly, seeking an urgent meeting with Amara to discuss licensing the supply chain technology. When those calls were politely deflected, Steinberg attempted to reach her through mutual business contacts and industry associations. His desperation grew more apparent as initial reports from his competitors showed the dramatic improvements they were already experiencing. The third component of Amara's assault targeted Continental Manufacturing, whose CEO James Patterson had chuckled at Blackwell's question as though casual bigotry was merely entertaining conversation. Patterson's company produced specialized components for automotive and aerospace industries, but their manufacturing processes were decades behind current technological capabilities. Amara's approach here was even more surgical. She identified Patterson's 3 most valuable engineers and offered them positions at Technova with salary increases of 40%, equity stakes in the company, and opportunities to work on cutting-edge automation projects. All 3 accepted within a week, bringing with them intimate knowledge of Continental's processes, client relationships, and strategic vulnerabilities. Simultaneously, she approached Continental's largest suppliers with acquisition offers that they couldn't refuse. These weren't hostile takeovers, but mutually beneficial arrangements that provided the suppliers with capital for expansion while giving Teknova control over Continental's raw material access. The strategy was elegant in its simplicity. She was systematically dismantling her target's operational foundations while building stronger competitive positions for herself. By week's end, the financial media was describing Teknova's aggressive expansion as a masterclass in strategic business warfare. Industry analysts noted the precision with which Amara had identified and exploited her competitors' weaknesses, the speed of her execution, and the comprehensive nature of her assault across multiple business sectors. Harrison Blackwell's second voicemail was less composed than his first. "Miss Stevens, we need to talk. What you're doing is business suicide. You're making enemies of every major player in the consortium. This aggressive approach will backfire eventually." Again, she didn't return his call. The battlefield was expanding exactly as she had planned, and her enemies were beginning to understand that their casual prejudices had awakened a strategic genius whose capabilities they had fatally underestimated. The counterattack came from multiple directions simultaneously, orchestrated with the desperate coordination of cornered predators. Harrison Blackwell had spent the weekend making phone calls to regulatory contacts, industry allies, and political connections, weaving together a coalition united by their shared threat perception and, though unspoken, their discomfort with being outmaneuvered by a Black woman entrepreneur. Monday morning brought the first salvo, a surprise audit announcement from the Financial Conduct Authority, citing concerns about rapid expansion in regulated financial services sectors and the need to ensure compliance with established consumer protection protocols. The timing was suspicious, coming just days after Teknova's successful entry into commercial lending, and the language suggested influence from established financial institutions feeling threatened by technological disruption. Simultaneously, Apex Therapeutics filed a lawsuit alleging that Teknova had engaged in predatory business practices designed to manipulate market competition through exclusive dealing arrangements. The complaint claimed that Amara's favorable contracts with their competitors constituted anti-competitive behavior that violated federal trade regulations. Legal experts immediately noted the irony of established monopolists accusing a disruptive newcomer of unfair competition practices. The third attack was perhaps most insidious, a coordinated media campaign questioning Teknova's corporate governance, financial transparency, and rapid growth trajectory. Articles appeared in financial publications suggesting that the company's expansion was unsustainable and built on unproven technology that could expose clients to significant risks. The sources for these articles were unnamed industry experts and regulatory insiders, whose concerns seemed remarkably similar across different publications. Amara convened her crisis management team within hours of the first media reports. Her communications director, former CNN journalist Angela Martinez, had anticipated such attacks and prepared comprehensive response strategies. "This is textbook competitive warfare," Angela explained. "They're using regulatory capture, legal harassment, and media manipulation to slow our momentum while they develop their own competing solutions." The regulatory audit posed the most immediate threat, potentially freezing Teknova's lending operations while investigators examined their compliance procedures. However, Amara had learned from observing how established players navigated regulatory challenges. Preparation, transparency, and strategic cooperation typically yielded better outcomes than defensive resistance. "We'll exceed their audit expectations," she announced to her team. "They want to find compliance issues? We'll demonstrate compliance standards that make the traditional banks look primitive. They think rapid growth indicates reckless behavior? We'll show them growth built on superior technology and rigorous risk management." Her legal team, led by former federal prosecutor David Kumar, took aggressive approaches to the litigation challenges. Rather than simply defending against Apex's allegations, they filed countersuits alleging that the established companies had engaged in coordinated efforts to suppress competition through regulatory manipulation and frivolous legal actions. The countersuits requested damages for reputational harm and sought injunctions against further anti-competitive behavior. The media campaign required more sophisticated responses. Angela Martinez organized a comprehensive publicity offensive featuring Teknova's actual clients, technological innovations, and measurable business outcomes. Customer testimonials demonstrated real value creation rather than speculative concerns. Independent technology experts provided technical analysis, showing the superiority of Teknova's platforms compared to legacy systems. Most importantly, Amara herself took center stage in defending her company's expansion. Her appearance on CNBC's Squawk Box was a masterclass in crisis communication, combining technical expertise with strategic vision and personal authenticity. When the host asked about allegations of anti-competitive behavior, her response was swift and pointed. The same executives who spent decades maintaining oligopolistic control over essential financial services are now complaining about competition? They had 20 years to innovate and instead chose to extract maximum profits from outdated systems. When someone finally offers consumers better alternatives, suddenly they're concerned about market manipulation? The only manipulation here is their attempt to use regulatory capture to maintain artificial barriers to entry. The interview went viral, shared widely across social media platforms where public sentiment increasingly favored innovative challengers over established institutions. Comment sections overflowed with support for Amara's position and criticism of the traditional players' defensive tactics. By week's end, the coordinated attack had backfired spectacularly. The regulatory audit was proceeding smoothly, with preliminary findings indicating that Teknova's compliance standards exceeded industry norms. The litigation was revealing embarrassing coordination between supposedly competing companies, and the media campaign had generated more positive publicity for Teknova than any marketing budget could have purchased. Harrison Blackwell's third voicemail arrived Friday evening, his voice strained with barely controlled anger. "You have no idea what you're dealing with, Stevens. This consortium represents centuries of collective business experience. You cannot win against all of us." This time, she called back. "Hello, Harrison." Amara's voice was calm, almost serene, as she leaned back in her office chair overlooking San Francisco's financial district. The lights of competing corporations twinkled below, their windows revealing late-night strategizing sessions as her adversaries scrambled to contain the damage she had systematically inflicted. "Stevens, we need to end this madness before it destroys all of us." Blackwell's voice crackled through the speaker, his usual patrician composure replaced by barely controlled desperation. "Your little stunt has cost my company $2 billion in market value, but you're making enemies who won't forget this kind of aggression. There are ways to resolve business disputes that don't require scorched earth tactics." She allowed silence to stretch between them, knowing that powerful men like Blackwell interpreted quiet pauses as weakness when they came from people they considered inferior. After 30 seconds, she spoke with the measured cadence of someone explaining basic concepts to a slow learner. "Harrison, I haven't employed any tactics that you and your colleagues haven't used routinely for decades. The only difference is that I'm better at strategic warfare than you anticipated." "This is about more than business competition," he snapped, his carefully constructed facade finally cracking. "You're targeting us personally, using our private comments against us in public markets." That conversation was privileged consortium discussion, not intended for broader distribution or retaliation. Privileged. Amara's laugh was soft but cutting. "You asked who invited her in a room full of witnesses, broadcasting your assumption that successful Black women don't belong at tables where real power is discussed. That wasn't privileged communication. It was public demonstration of your fundamental misunderstanding of modern business reality." She continued without allowing him to interrupt. "You operate under the delusion that your networks, your connections, and your shared prejudices provide some kind of competitive moat. But markets don't care about your comfort level with diversity. Consumers don't evaluate products based on the skin color of their creators. Innovation doesn't respect your assumptions about who deserves to succeed. What do you want?" The question came out defeated, stripped of the entitlement that had characterized his earlier communications.
"Money?
Partnership terms? Market share agreements? Everything has a price, Stevens. Name yours." "You still don't understand," she replied, genuine amazement creeping into her voice. "This was never about negotiation or compromise. When you asked who invited me, you revealed something essential about your character and your worldview. You demonstrated that you see successful people who don't look like you as anomalies requiring explanation rather than competitors deserving respect. She stood and walked to her office window, looking down at the city where she had built her empire through brilliance, persistence, and strategic excellence. I don't want your money, Harrison. I don't need your partnerships or your market share agreements. What I want is for you and your colleagues to understand that the business world has fundamentally changed. The old boys club that protected mediocre executives through shared prejudices and mutual backscratching is obsolete. So, what happens now? His voice had taken on the hollow tone of someone recognizing inevitable defeat. Now you learn what markets look like when they're driven by merit rather than connections, Amara explained patiently. Your company will either innovate rapidly enough to remain competitive, or it will become another cautionary tale about organizations that mistook temporary privilege for permanent advantage. Your choice. She paused, allowing the implications to settle before delivering her final message. And Harrison? The next time someone asks who invited a successful person to participate in business discussions, I suggest you remember that in modern markets, capability is the only invitation that matters. Those who forget that lesson tend to find themselves excluded from future conversations entirely. The line went dead, leaving Blackwell alone with the echoes of his crumbling assumptions and the reality of facing an opponent whose strategic brilliance he had fatally underestimated. Miles away, Amara Stevens smiled and began planning the next phase of her campaign, one that would demonstrate conclusively why prejudice was not just morally wrong but strategically suicidal in 21st century business competition. The cascade began with Continental Manufacturing, whose structural vulnerabilities proved impossible to shore up once Amara's surgical strikes had exposed them. James Patterson's company had operated for decades on thin margins sustained through political connections and supplier relationships that discouraged competition. When Teknova acquired their 3 primary raw material providers, Continental's production costs increased by 30% overnight, while their competitors enjoyed preferential pricing and priority access to essential components. Patterson's desperate attempts to secure alternative suppliers revealed the depth of his strategic miscalculation. Teknova's acquisition spree had been methodical and comprehensive, targeting not just Continental's current providers, but also their potential backup options. The few remaining suppliers demanded premium pricing that made Continental's products uncompetitive in increasingly price-sensitive markets. She's systematically dismantling our entire operational foundation, Patterson confessed during an emergency board meeting, his voice hollow with the recognition of inevitable defeat. Every alternative we explore leads back to companies she now controls or influences. It's not just aggressive competition, it's strategic annihilation. His board of directors, composed largely of aging executives who had supervised Continental's gradual technological obsolescence, struggled to comprehend how quickly their market position had deteriorated. The company that had dominated specialized manufacturing for 2 generations was facing bankruptcy within months, its demise accelerated by their leadership's failure to recognize shifting competitive dynamics. Meanwhile, Apex Therapeutics was discovering that their lawsuit strategy had backfired catastrophically. Teknova's legal team had filed discovery motions that exposed decades of anti-competitive practices, price-fixing agreements, and regulatory capture tactics that Apex had employed to maintain market dominance. Internal emails revealed executive discussions about suppressing innovative competitors through coordinated legal harassment and political influence peddling. Dr. Steinberg, his chief counsel, warned during a tense strategy session, continuing this litigation will expose us to potentially billions in damages from counterclaims. Their discovery requests are uncovering practices that could trigger federal criminal investigations. We need to consider settlement options immediately. But settlement proved impossible because Amara had no interest in negotiating with companies whose executives had demonstrated fundamental disrespect for competitive markets and innovative entrepreneurs. Her public statements made clear that she viewed the litigation as an opportunity to expose systemic corruption within established industries rather than a business dispute requiring compromise. The financial media coverage had shifted dramatically as Teknova's strategic brilliance became undeniable. Business school professors began analyzing her campaign as a case study in modern competitive warfare, highlighting the precision with which she had identified and exploited her adversaries' structural weaknesses. Articles praised her technological innovations while contrasting them with the defensive mediocrity that characterized her opponents' responses. What we're witnessing is evolutionary pressure in real time, Harvard Business School professor Dr. Michael Chen explained during a widely viewed interview. Companies that relied on artificial barriers to competition are being displaced by organizations that compete on pure merit. Teknova represents the future of business, technological excellence, strategic innovation, and leadership that reflects modern demographic realities. The most devastating blow came when Fortune magazine published an investigative article titled "The Last Boys Club: How Prejudice Became a Competitive Disadvantage." The piece documented the consortium dinner, where Blackwell had asked his infamous question, using interviews with multiple witnesses to reconstruct not just the conversation but the broader pattern of discriminatory behavior that characterized industry leadership. "The irony is profound," the article concluded. These executives spent decades excluding talented individuals based on demographic characteristics rather than capability. When one of those excluded individuals finally gained access to capital markets and technological resources, she demonstrated competitive advantages that their networks couldn't counter. Their prejudices didn't just harm others, they blinded them to the threats and opportunities that ultimately determined their survival. Harrison Blackwell's fourth voicemail arrived the day after Fortune's article was published, his voice stripped of all pretense. "Stevens, you've won. My board is demanding my resignation. Meridian's stock price has fallen 60%. Our clients are abandoning us faster than we can count. What more do you want?" This time, she didn't call back. The dominoes were falling exactly as she had orchestrated, each failure cascading into the next as her opponents discovered that their shared prejudices had created shared vulnerabilities. The empire they had built on exclusion and assumption was collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions. By month's end, all three companies were in advanced settlement discussions with their respective stakeholders, their market positions so compromised that recovery seemed impossible. The consortium that had once seemed invulnerable had been revealed as a collection of mediocre executives whose success had depended on artificial barriers rather than genuine excellence. 6 months after Harrison Blackwell's fateful question, the business landscape had been irreversibly transformed. Continental Manufacturing filed for bankruptcy in March, its assets acquired by a consortium of Teknova partners who implemented advanced automation systems that tripled production efficiency while reducing costs. The irony was stark. The company that had dismissed Amara's presence was now operating under systems she had designed, managed by executives who shared her vision of technological innovation and inclusive leadership. Apex Therapeutics survived, but barely. Their legal settlement with Teknova included technology licensing agreements that effectively made them dependent on their former adversaries' platforms. Richard Steinberg's resignation had been inevitable once shareholders realized that his leadership had transformed a market leader into a struggling subsidiary of more innovative competitors. His replacement, Dr. Maria Gonzalez, was a former Teknova consultant who immediately began implementing supply chain optimizations that Steinberg had rejected as unnecessary technological complexity. Meridian Financial's collapse was perhaps most dramatic because of its scale and symbolic importance. Harrison Blackwell's resignation came too late to save the institution he had led for 15 years. Their commercial lending division was acquired by Teknova in a deal that provided existing clients with superior service while eliminating thousands of redundant positions. The marble halls where Blackwell had once held court over discriminatory conversations were now occupied by diverse teams of engineers and analysts who viewed technological excellence as the only relevant metric for business success. "The transformation has exceeded our most optimistic projections," Marcus Chen reported during Teknova's quarterly board meeting. "Revenue has increased by 340%. Our client base has expanded into 12 new market sectors, and our technological capabilities have advanced by approximately 18 months ahead of original schedules. The acquisitions have provided resources and market access that would have taken years to develop organically." But Amara's satisfaction came less from financial metrics than from observing how quickly markets adapted once artificial barriers were removed. The commercial lending sector that Meridian had dominated through relationships and regulatory capture was now characterized by transparent algorithms, competitive pricing, and service quality that actually served client needs rather than institutional profits. Young entrepreneurs who had previously struggled to access capital were now receiving loans based on business potential rather than personal connections. Small businesses that had been ignored by traditional banks were finding competitive financing for expansion and innovation. The democratization of financial access was generating economic growth that benefited entire communities previously excluded from opportunity. The supply chain optimizations that had destroyed Continental and transformed Apex were being implemented across dozens of industries, reducing costs while improving quality and reliability. Manufacturing jobs that had been eliminated through Teknova's automation were being replaced by higher-skilled positions in system design, maintenance, and optimization. The economic disruption was real, but so were the opportunities for workers willing to adapt to technological change. Industry associations that had once excluded or marginalized entrepreneurs like Amara were now competing to recruit diverse leadership and promote innovative thinking. The International Business Consortium, which had provided the venue for Blackwell's insulting question, appointed its first Black female president and implemented policies requiring technological literacy and diversity metrics for all member organizations. The remarkable aspect, Harvard's Dr. Chin observed in his follow-up analysis, is not just that Teknova succeeded, but how quickly the entire business ecosystem adapted once competitive barriers were removed. It suggests that artificial constraints had been suppressing innovation and efficiency across multiple sectors simultaneously. Amara's personal transformation was equally significant. The woman who had once been asked who invited her was now receiving invitation requests from governments, universities, and international organizations seeking her expertise on technological innovation, competitive strategy, and inclusive business leadership. Speaking engagements were booked months in advance, with audiences eager to understand how she had systematically dismantled established competitors while building sustainable competitive advantages. Her TED Talk, titled When Merit Meets Opportunity, Rebuilding Business for the 21st Century, received over 10 million views in its first month. The presentation combined personal narrative with strategic analysis, explaining how prejudice had created market inefficiencies that innovative competitors could exploit through technological superiority and inclusive leadership practices. The question wasn't who invited me. She concluded her talk to thunderous applause. The question was why it took so long for markets to recognize that competitive advantage comes from capability, not connections. When we rebuild business around merit rather than prejudice, everyone benefits except those whose success depended on excluding superior competitors. The transformation was complete, but Amara understood that her victory represented beginning rather than conclusion. The real work lay ahead, building sustainable systems that would prevent future generations of entrepreneurs from facing the barriers she had overcome through strategic brilliance and technological innovation. 2 years after Harrison Blackwell's question echoed through the Heritage Room, Amara Stevens stood before the United Nations Economic Council, addressing global leaders about the future of international business cooperation. The woman who had once been asked who invited her was now shaping policies that would govern trillion-dollar markets and affect billions of lives worldwide. Teknova had evolved far beyond its origins as a disruptive startup into something unprecedented, a technology conglomerate that prioritized social impact alongside financial returns. The company's artificial intelligence platforms were being deployed across developing nations to improve healthcare delivery, educational access, and economic opportunity. What had begun as competitive warfare against prejudiced executives had transformed into a blueprint for inclusive capitalism that generated prosperity while addressing global challenges. The traditional model of business success, she explained to the assembled delegates, was built on scarcity thinking, the assumption that one person's advancement required another's exclusion. But technology has made abundance possible if we're willing to abandon systems that were designed to concentrate opportunity among narrow demographics. Her words carried the authority of someone who had proven these principles through measurable results rather than theoretical arguments. The numbers were undeniable. Technova's employment had grown to over 200,000 people across 47 countries, with diversity metrics that reflected global demographics rather than historical exclusions. Their average employee satisfaction scores exceeded industry benchmarks by significant margins, while productivity and innovation rates suggested that inclusive hiring practices generated competitive advantages that homogeneous organizations couldn't match. More importantly, the companies that had survived Technova's initial assault had themselves transformed. Apex Therapeutics, under Dr. Gonzalez's leadership, had become a model of technological innovation and inclusive management. Their life-saving medical devices were now being manufactured using Technova's optimized systems and distributed through partnership networks that prioritized global health outcomes over pure profit maximization. Even Meridian Financial had found new life under different ownership. The institution that Harrison Blackwell had led through prejudice and complacency was now operating as Meridian Community Partners, providing microfinance and small business loans to entrepreneurs who had previously been excluded from traditional banking. The marble halls that had once hosted discriminatory conversations were now filled with diverse teams working to democratize access to capital across underserved communities. Harrison Blackwell himself had undergone a personal transformation that surprised former colleagues and competitors alike. His resignation from Meridian had been followed by a period of reflection that led to his current role as director of the Blackwell Foundation for Inclusive Business Education. The foundation, funded entirely from his personal wealth, provided scholarships and mentorship for entrepreneurs from underrepresented backgrounds. "I spent decades operating under assumptions that I never questioned," he had written in a widely circulated Harvard Business Review article titled, "The Cost of Prejudice, a Former CEO's Confession." When I asked who invited Amara Stevens to our table, I was really asking why the world was changing in ways that challenged my comfort with familiar hierarchies. Her response taught me that capability doesn't require invitation. It creates its own opportunities when artificial barriers are removed. His foundation had already provided support for over 5,000 entrepreneurs, with particular focus on technology startups led by women and minorities. The irony was profound but genuinely redemptive. The man whose prejudice had catalyzed Amara's devastating campaign was now actively working to ensure that future generations wouldn't face similar barriers to success. The broader business community had absorbed these lessons with remarkable speed once market consequences became undeniable. Business schools had revised their curricula to emphasize inclusive leadership and technological innovation as essential competitive requirements. Corporate boards were implementing diversity requirements not from regulatory pressure, but from recognition that homogeneous leadership created strategic blind spots that competitors could exploit. Venture capital firms that had previously overlooked entrepreneurs like Amara were now competing aggressively to identify and fund innovative companies led by previously excluded demographics. The pattern was consistent across industries. Organizations that embraced technological change and demographic inclusion were outperforming those that clung to traditional assumptions about leadership and capability. "What we've learned," Amara continued her UN address, "is that prejudice isn't just morally problematic, it's strategically disastrous in modern markets. When you exclude talented people based on irrelevant characteristics, you're not protecting your competitive position. You're creating opportunities for those excluded individuals to build superior alternatives that will eventually displace your organization entirely." As she concluded her presentation to sustained applause, Amara reflected on the journey that had brought her from that humiliating moment in the Heritage Room to this global platform for influence and change. The question, who invited her, had been answered definitively. She had invited herself through excellence, persistence, and strategic brilliance that her opponents had fatally underestimated. But more importantly, she had used her success to ensure that future entrepreneurs wouldn't need to prove their worth through such destructive campaigns. The systems she had built, the precedents she had established, and the cultural changes she had catalyzed were creating pathways for others to achieve success based on merit rather than connections, capability rather than comfort with existing hierarchies. The empire that had risen from the ashes of her adversaries' prejudices was built on principles that would outlast any individual leader or organization. It was an empire of opportunity, innovation, and inclusion. One that answered the question of who belongs at tables of power with a simple response: anyone capable of creating value and driving positive change. The woman who had once been asked who invited her had become the architect of a business world where such questions were not just unnecessary but obsolete. In the end, that transformation represented a victory more complete and lasting than any financial metric could measure.